The human waste frozen to your shoes would be the least of your problems. In a real Viking longhouse in 982 AD, 37 people shared one room the size of a modern garage, and the floor was covered in a mixture of animal dung, rotting food scraps, and human excrement that hadn't been cleaned in 6 months. The smell hit visitors like a physical wall, so thick you could taste it, so overwhelming that grown warriors vomited the moment they stepped inside. But that stench wasn't just disgusting. It was actively trying to kill you through diseases that claimed half of all Viking children before their 5th birthday. 37 people lived there permanently: men, women, children, elderly, and slaves, along with 12 pigs, 8 goats, and 23 chickens. There was no separate room for anything. People ate, slept, fought, gave birth, and died in the same space where animals lived and food was stored. The walls were made of wood and mud that leaked constantly, creating puddles of freezing water mixed with urine that never dried. The temperature inside never rose above 43 degrees Fahrenheit, even in summer. In winter, it dropped to 26 degrees, and people literally froze to death in their sleep. The only heat came from a single fire pit in the center of the room, but the smoke had nowhere to go, except through a hole in the roof that was too small to work properly. Everyone lived in a constant cloud of wood smoke so thick it burned their eyes and made them cough blood. The smoke was so dense that people developed permanent respiratory damage by age 20. Breakfast was usually fermented fish that had been buried in the ground for 3 months, mixed with barley that was half mold and half grain. The fish was so putrid it glowed in the dark from bacterial activity, but eating rotten food was normal because fresh food was impossible to preserve. Vikings regularly died from food poisoning, but they had no choice except to eat spoiled meat or starve. Every drop of water contained intestinal parasites that caused chronic diarrhea, stomach pain, and bloody stools. Vikings were so accustomed to being sick that constant diarrhea was considered normal health. Children who survived their first year had already developed immunity to parasites that would kill a modern person in days. People slept on the floor using animal skins that were crawling with fleas, lice, and mites. The animals slept with the humans for warmth, which meant waking up covered in pig feces and chicken droppings. Everyone slept in their clothes because undressing meant freezing to death, so the same clothes were worn for months without washing. Vikings wore wool that had never been washed, leather that still had rotting flesh attached, and fur that was home to thousands of parasites. Their clothes were so filthy they could stand up by themselves when removed. Everyone was constantly scratching bloody wounds caused by lice, fleas, and scabies mites. The itching was so severe that people clawed their skin raw, causing infections that often turned fatal. Everyone could see, hear, and smell everything everyone else did 24 hours a day. When someone had diarrhea, which happened constantly, everyone in the longhouse knew immediately. When couples had sex, which they did regardless of who was watching, it happened in front of children, grandparents, and strangers. When someone died, which happened frequently, the body stayed in the longhouse for days until the ground thawed enough for burial. The bathroom was a hole in the ground outside that was shared by everyone in the village. In winter, the hole froze solid, so people relieved themselves wherever they could, usually inside the longhouse. Human waste accumulated in corners and was left there until spring, when it could be shoveled out. The smell was so overwhelming that visitors often fainted, but Vikings had lost their sense of smell from constant exposure to ammonia fumes. Viking men settled every disagreement with weapons, and fights to the death happened inside the longhouse regularly. Blood on the walls was normal decoration. Children watched adults kill each other over insults, food disputes, or sleeping arrangements. Women were considered property and were beaten, raped, and traded like animals. A typical longhouse saw at least one murder per month, usually involving axes, knives, or bare hands. Slaves, who made up 30% of the population, were beaten daily and worked until they died of exhaustion. Free Vikings could kill slaves without consequences, and dead slaves were fed to the pigs. Children learned to fight by practicing on slaves, and beating a slave to death was considered normal childhood development. Tuberculosis killed 40% of Vikings before age 30. Dysentery caused people to literally shit themselves to death over the course of several agonizing weeks. Skin diseases caused by poor hygiene made people's flesh rot off their bodies while they were still alive. When someone got sick, everyone got sick because isolation was impossible. Vikings' teeth rotted out of their heads by age 25 because they ate nothing but fermented, moldy food and had never heard of dental hygiene. Most adults had fewer than 10 teeth remaining, and those teeth were black stumps that caused constant pain. Tooth abscesses killed people regularly when the infection spread to their brains. Children's teeth fell out before their adult teeth grew in, leaving them unable to chew solid food. Vikings believed that depression, anxiety, and schizophrenia were caused by evil spirits, so they beat mentally ill people with sticks to drive the demons out. People who couldn't handle the stress of longhouse life were abandoned in the wilderness to die. Suicide was common, especially among women who were forced into marriage and pregnancy before age 14. There were no weekends, no vacations, no sick days, and no retirement. People worked until they died, usually from exhaustion, injury, or disease before age 40. Children started working at age 5 and were expected to perform adult labor by age 10. Food preparation was a nightmare of contamination and spoilage. Vikings cooked meat that was already rotting because fresh meat was impossible to preserve. They ate insects, tree bark, and grass when food ran out, which happened regularly. Cooking was done in pots that were never cleaned and hadn't been washed in years. The cooking fire was the same fire used to burn human waste, so everything tasted like smoke and excrement. Besides the constant wood smoke, the air contained methane gas from human and animal waste, ammonia fumes from urine, and hydrogen sulfide from rotting food. The combination created a toxic atmosphere that caused headaches, nausea, and respiratory failure. Modern people would need gas masks to survive the air quality that Vikings breathed every day. 47% of Viking women died during or immediately after childbirth because of malnutrition, disease, and complete lack of medical knowledge. Babies were born into the same filthy conditions that killed adults, and 60% of children died before age 5. Women were expected to give birth and return to work the same day, regardless of complications, bleeding, or infection. If someone insulted you, trial by combat was the standard legal procedure. Vikings believed that the gods decided legal disputes through battle, so the person who survived was automatically right. Court cases were settled with axes, swords, and clubs until one party was dead. Water was scarce and contaminated year-round. Vikings got their water from streams, wells, and rain collection that were polluted with animal corpses, human waste, and industrial runoff from metalworking. The water was brown, thick with sediment, and tasted like sulfur. Boiling water was not understood as a purification method, so people drank raw sewage and wondered why they constantly had stomach problems. The tanning process used human urine and animal brains, which left clothes permanently soaked in bodily fluids. Leather clothing became rock hard when it dried and cut into people's skin like sandpaper. Everyone had permanent scars and open wounds from their own clothing. Trade and economics were controlled by whoever was strongest and most violent. Vikings didn't have money in the modern sense. They traded in stolen goods, slaves, and raw materials. Most economic disputes were settled by raids, murders, and kidnapping. A successful businessman was someone who could kill his competitors and steal their property without getting killed himself. Most people went months without bathing, and when they did bathe, it was in the same contaminated water they drank. Soap didn't exist, so people tried to clean themselves with sand, ash, and urine. Their hair was matted with grease, blood, and parasites that formed permanent dreadlocks. The religious practices involved regular human sacrifice and ritual violence. Vikings believed their gods demanded blood offerings, so they regularly killed slaves, prisoners, and volunteers in gruesome ceremonies. The sacrifices took place inside or next to the longhouse, so everyone lived surrounded by human skulls, bones, and bloodstains. Children grew up watching people get tortured to death as part of normal religious observance. Medical treatment was based on superstition and usually made injuries worse. Vikings believed that illness was caused by evil spirits, so their treatments involved beating sick people, burning them with hot irons, or drilling holes in their skulls to let the demons out. Surgery was performed with dirty knives and no anesthesia. Most medical procedures killed the patient faster than the original disease would have. Their music was about murder, rape, and war. Their stories glorified violence and taught children that killing was the highest form of achievement. There were no books, no art, no peaceful activities of any kind. Girls were married off at age 12 or 13 to men they'd never met, often men old enough to be their grandfathers. Wedding ceremonies involved the husband demonstrating his ownership by publicly beating or raping his new wife. Divorce was only available to men, and usually involved killing the woman to prevent her from remarrying. A successful Viking was someone who had killed the most people and stolen the most property. The entire economy was based on making other people's lives worse. The combination of toxic air, contaminated water, violent social dynamics, and exposure to diseases that your immune system has never encountered would kill you within hours. Even if you somehow survived the physical conditions, the psychological trauma of watching constant violence, smelling rotting corpses, and living in conditions worse than modern prisons would drive you insane before sunrise. Summer brought swarms of flies, mosquitoes, and biting insects that covered every surface of the longhouse. The insects laid eggs in the rotting food, human waste, and open wounds that everyone carried. Maggots crawled through the living space constantly, and Vikings ate them because protein was protein. The insect bites caused infections that killed people regularly, and there was no escape from the buzzing, biting cloud that filled the air from sunrise to sunset. The longhouse became a tomb where people froze solid while still breathing. Ice formed on the inside walls from frozen breath, and people's clothes froze to their bodies overnight. The animals died from cold, and their frozen corpses were left inside the longhouse because the ground was too hard to dig graves. Vikings burned furniture, tools, and even their own clothes to keep the fire going, but the heat never reached more than 3 feet from the flames. The hierarchy of who slept closest to the fire determined who lived and who died. The most powerful Vikings slept in the warmest spots, while slaves and children were forced to sleep near the walls where temperatures dropped below freezing. People fought bloody battles over sleeping positions, and the losers literally died of exposure while lying 6 feet away from people who survived the night. When food ran out, which happened every winter, Vikings ate leather, tree bark, and anything else they could chew. They boiled bones over and over until the bones crumbled into powder, then ate the powder. Cannibalism was not uncommon during the worst famines, and parents sometimes ate their own children to survive until spring. Vikings stored meat by burying it in the ground or hanging it in the rafters where it rotted slowly over months. The meat was covered in mold, crawling with maggots, and green with decay. But eating rotten meat was better than starving. They stored grain in baskets that were infested with rats, mice, and insects, so every meal included rodent droppings and bug parts. Vikings collected rainwater in wooden barrels that were never cleaned and housed algae, bacteria, and dead animals. The water turned green and slimy within days, but they drank it anyway because dehydration killed faster than water poisoning. In winter, they melted snow and ice that was contaminated with animal urine and human waste from the surrounding area. Vikings never cleaned their knives, axes, or farming tools because soap didn't exist and water was too valuable to waste on cleaning. Every tool was contaminated with bacteria from previous use, so even minor cuts became infected and led to amputation or death. Tetanus from dirty tools killed strong adult Vikings within days. The pots were never glazed or properly fired, so they absorbed everything that was cooked in them over years of use. The accumulated bacteria, grease, and food residue made the pots toxic breeding grounds for disease. Every meal was contaminated by the cooking vessel itself. Leather goods were tanned using a process that involved soaking animal skins in human urine for weeks. The urine tanning created leather that was permanently soaked in ammonia and other toxic chemicals. Vikings wore this chemically treated leather directly against their skin, causing chemical burns, rashes, and permanent scarring. The leather never stopped smelling like concentrated urine, and the smell intensified when it got wet. The floor of the longhouse was not just dirty, it was archaeologically layered with decades of accumulated filth. Archaeologists have found longhouse floors with 7 distinct layers of compacted human waste, animal bones, rotting food, and other debris. Each layer represented years of daily life, and the floor was essentially a compressed monument to human suffering. Walking on the floor meant walking on the decomposed remains of everything that had lived and died in that space. Vikings had no windows because glass didn't exist, and openings in the walls would let in deadly cold. The only light came from the central fire, which created a tiny circle of dim, flickering orange light surrounded by complete darkness. Most of the longhouse was invisible most of the time, so people lived in constant shadows where they couldn't see danger, obstacles, or even other people until they were within arm's reach. People coughed, wheezed, and gasped from smoke inhalation and respiratory disease 24 hours a day. Children cried from hunger, cold, and pain constantly. Adults groaned from infected wounds, broken bones, and chronic illness. The animals made noise continuously: pigs squealing, chickens clucking, goats bleating. The combined noise made sleep almost impossible and drove people to violence just to get a moment of quiet. The metalworking was done inside the longhouse, using a forge that filled the already toxic air with additional poisonous fumes. Vikings smelted iron and other metals using fires that produced carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, and other gases that caused brain damage, organ failure, and death. The metalworkers developed permanent respiratory damage and usually died young from lung disease, but they had no choice because metal tools were essential for survival. Vikings spun wool into thread, using wheels that were contaminated with grease, blood, and bacteria from unwashed hands. They wove cloth on looms that had never been cleaned and were home to colonies of insects and parasites. The finished textiles were immediately infested with the same parasites that lived on the production equipment. Human waste was collected in pots that were dumped outside when they overflowed, which wasn't often because the pots were huge and people were constantly sick with diarrhea. The waste accumulated in piles around the longhouse that attracted rats, flies, and other disease vectors. In winter, the waste froze into solid piles that thawed in spring and created toxic runoff that contaminated everything downstream. Women gave birth on the same filthy floor where animals lived and people defecated. There were no medical tools, no sanitation, no pain relief, and no understanding of infection. Women often died from blood loss, infection, or complications that could be easily treated today. Babies were born into an environment so toxic that survival to adulthood was statistically unlikely. They were forced to work in dangerous conditions from age 5, handling sharp tools, dangerous animals, and toxic materials. Child mortality was so high that parents didn't name children until they were several years old, because naming a child who would probably die was considered bad luck. The elderly were treated like broken furniture that took up valuable space. When older Vikings could no longer work, they were given less food, worse sleeping spots, and no medical care. Many elderly people died from neglect, exposure, or outright abandonment during harsh winters. Some elderly Vikings committed suicide rather than face another winter of slow starvation and cold. Vikings had no immunity to diseases from other parts of Europe, so trade expeditions often returned with plagues that killed entire families. The returning traders were not quarantined because quarantine was not understood, so diseases spread immediately through the close quarters of the longhouse. The raiding parties brought back traumatized slaves who often carried diseases and psychological damage that made them dangerous. Newly captured slaves frequently tried to escape, committed suicide, or attacked their captors. The longhouse was constantly dealing with the chaos of broken people who had been torn from their homes and forced into horrific conditions. Spring melting and heavy rains caused rivers to overflow, flooding longhouses with contaminated water that carried human waste, dead animals, and toxic runoff. Vikings had to live in the flooded conditions because they had nowhere else to go, and the flooding created ideal breeding conditions for disease-carrying insects and bacteria. The central fire pit was surrounded by flammable materials: wooden walls, animal skins, stored grain, and human hair. House fires were common and usually fatal because there was no escape route and no way to fight the fire effectively. When a longhouse burned, everyone inside usually died from smoke inhalation or burns. Viking longhouses were built with whatever materials were available, including rotting wood, mud mixed with human waste, and stones that had been used as grave markers. The building materials constantly shed particles into the air that people breathed, and the structural integrity was so poor that walls and roofs collapsed regularly, crushing the people inside. Vikings were expected to watch and participate in ritual sacrifices, public executions, and violent entertainment. Children were required to witness these events as part of their education. Refusing to participate was considered weakness and could result in exile or death. Vikings didn't live this way because they chose to. They lived this way because these were the only conditions that allowed any human survival in medieval Scandinavia. What we call Viking culture was actually just barely controlled desperation, and the people who survived it were the ones who could adapt to conditions that would be considered torture by modern standards. Your 24 hours wouldn't even begin. The first breath of air inside a real Viking longhouse would send you into respiratory failure. The first step on the floor would infect you with parasites that would kill you slowly over weeks, and the first sight of the living conditions would cause psychological trauma that would require years of therapy to overcome. You wouldn't last 24 minutes, let alone 24 hours.